We are ready in our outline with the tests after the deportation. It's found in the section of chapter 1, verse 3 through 21. Is number 2, verses 8 through 14. We've noticed the trials in light of the deportation, the seizure, and then what I like to call the sorrow because of the things which were encumbered upon them by virtue of being in a pagan country. Now then, in light of the deportation, following their trials, here are the tests. Verses 8 through 14. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. And the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink, for why should he see your faces worse liking than the king than the children which are of your sort? Then shall you make me endanger my head to the king. And said Daniel to Belshazzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us also vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our countenance be looked upon before thee, and the countenance of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat. And as thou seest, deal with thy servants. So he consented to them in this matter and proved them 10 days. Now I believe what you've got here, you've got a threefold test. First of all, in verses 8 and 9, you have a test that confronts Daniel. Now then, I'm not sure that we have the whole story revealed here in these portions of Scripture, but what we do have, we have the adequate record as to the activities for these 4 godly boys there in the Babylonian captivity concerning their spiritual life in relationship to Jehovah. Now then, the diet that they were required to partake of was a diet that was going to cause them to be defiled under the Jewish law. Now, I just marvel and I look with great admiration upon the test that is encumbered upon these godly boys and the purpose of their hearts. Daniel here is acting as a spokesman, and he is the leader apparently in this regard. He and the 3 boys with him knew that what was required of them would cause them to be defiled before the Lord. Therefore, you find the vow upon their hearts not to defile themselves. Purposed in his heart not to defile himself. And I just can't help but re-emphasize over and over and over again the need there is for young people, and not only young people, but older folk today, to keep themselves pure before the Lord. We're a bunch of cop-outs, aren't we? We excuse ourselves by virtue of the circumstances which are before us. And we say, well, we can't help it. This is a requirement, isn't it? This is the law. Now look, we are under a law today that Daniel and his 3 friends didn't have. We are under a the law of democracy, such as it is. But boy, not there. They were under the law of absolute dictatorship. And whatever the king said, that was law. And in defiance of that law, it meant death. What does that speak with reference to the vow? He purposed in his heart not to defile himself. What was he doing? He was under a test of life and death. But he was willing to choose death rather than to defile himself. And to partake of this diet was going to defile him. Consequently, he went about doing something about it. And he requested that he might not. Now notice what that last of that verse says. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. What a request. What would a pagan lord view this as? You defile yourself? That's none of my business, is it? And isn't that ridiculous? Why, we over here, we of the Chaldeans, why, that doesn't defile. Now then, in verse 10, you have the test for the prince that Daniel has been brought in to favor with. You'll notice God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. Here was a sweet relationship. Now here's a test for the prince, to one that he dearly loved. He had made a request of him. Well, I want to tell you, he's on the griddle now, isn't he? But whereas the test for Daniel was defilement, now the test for the prince was death. And he said, listen, you're asking me to endanger my head to the king. Even though there was favor, love upon Daniel, as far as the prince of the eunuchs are concerned, it stopped when it came to the matter of requesting something that would endanger the prince of the eunuchs. Now get the contrast. Daniel was doing his best, even at the expense of death, isn't that right? But the prince of the eunuchs, death was before him. He wasn't going to bow to that. Now then, in verses 11 through 14, you have the test with reference to Melzar. And just to keep it in a little bit of alliteration here, I have the test concerning the days or the time trials. Daniel did not want to defile himself. The prince of the eunuchs, who was in danger of death. Now Melzar, he was requested with reference to certain days. And so, although the prince of the eunuchs did not give the request, now Daniel approaches Melzar, who is more or less the immediate overseer of these four boys, and Daniel proposes a plan. Only a 10-day plan. Now I can just imagine Melzar scratching his head. Well, 10 days isn't going to make much difference, is it? No. That's just a little over a week. Why, we'll just not say anything, and we'll grant this request. I rather imagine Melzar was well aware of the relationship that Daniel had with the prince of the eunuchs. Don't you? I rather imagine that he was fully aware that Daniel was a very special friend of the prince of the eunuchs, the superior to Melzar, and so this probably had a bearing, just as a political type thing, you know. That is all right. This plan. Now, Daniel didn't propose this plan to the prince of the eunuchs, did he? He just gave an outright request. But to Melzar, he had a plan. And I like the diligence of Daniel. Don't you? First, he wasn't going to defile himself. So he made the request. That request apparently was denied. So then, he figured out a plan. And I imagine Daniel and his three friends discussed this and came up with a plan that if Melzar would hear them, that he might give to them a test for 10 days. And so this is what Melzar did. He said, give us vegetables, Daniel said, and water. Not the food that had been dedicated to the idols, nor the wine from the king's table. But give us vegetables and give us water. And prove us for 10 days. All right, now then, let's see what takes place. Number 3 in your outline. The triumphs in verses 15 through 21. Verses 15 through 21. Now I suggest here that you have a threefold triumph. You have a triumph for Daniel, you have a triumph for Melzar, and then I believe you have unveiled in a very wonderful way the great triumph that God has wrought. Okay, let's notice verse 15. And at the end of 10 days, their countenance appeared fair and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. Now I don't know who all the children were, but there were many others, weren't there, involved. But here, with reference to Daniel and Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael and Azariah, just in 10 days, there's great victory. Great victory. Now this in itself is quite a miracle, isn't it? I realize we can put on weight pretty quick, but I know I can. I set up that table and it didn't take me too long, but it takes more than 10 days. Remember. And I don't know medication that'll help you, that is in countenance, work that fast. This takes a little while. But here was evidence, visible evidence of the great triumph for Daniel and his three friends in light of their purpose of heart. Now, someone's always going to come up with the proposition, well, what if it didn't work? What do you suppose Daniel, Hannah, Mishael, and Azariah do? I think they do just exactly what they did in the first place. That they would stick by their vow. They purposed in their heart, didn't they? And we see this brought out so nicely with the three boys, Ananias, Mishael, and Azariah, who were thrown into the fiery furnace as they stood before the king. He said, "Let it be known to you, king, we're not going to bow down, we're not going to worship. Our God is able. But if he chooses not to deliver us, be it known to you, we're not going to do it." So I think we've got a good answer for the one that would like to put up the proposition, well, what if? Nevertheless, that is not the record. Now then, in verse 16, I think you have a triumph for Melzar. And when Melzar saw the result of this request, what did he do? He took away the portion of their meat and the wine that they should drink, and he gave them their life. And that's her life. Melzar is getting quite an education here. What a testimony for the purpose of heart for Daniel and his companions. Melzar. Okay, this is great. Now then, in verses 17 through 21, I think you have in these verses the testimony of the greatness of God in light of this situation for his four boys who purposed in their heart not to defile themselves. And I really believe this is wonderful, folks. We're never going to have the same situation, but in principle we sure do. Have you ever come up to a place where it just seems as though you're against a brick wall, and if you went one way, you were going to be a failure. If you went the other way, well, you knew the other way would be right. I've seen so many take the other way, but I've seen a few that would make a choice to do the right thing. What happens after that? Isn't there great peace and joy of heart? There sure is. There sure is. But if you go the other way, if you're a cop-out, believe me, you're going to reap as you sow. Well, now here, these boys, remember, they are prisoners. They are under the order of the king. And the king has a number of underlings to oversee them. The king's word is law. And clear down on the bottom of the totem pole, you have a prisoner who purposed in his heart not to defile himself. Consequently, what takes place? He doesn't rest until he's in a situation whereby God can work. And God has worked. Now notice the great triumph. Not only was that true in verse 15, but now when you begin with verse 17. As for these four children, God gave. God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. where did the great ability, or when did the great ability come? When? After the test. Purpose, test, then God gave. It wasn't the training in the school of the Chaldeans. It wasn't the education. No. He said over here in verse 4, he said, bring the children in whom was no blemish, but well favored and skillful in all wisdom and cunning and knowledge and understanding science, and such has ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. Well, it wasn't the school. It was the grace of God God gave, and skill and on the learning. And at the end of the days, what days? What are those days? That's exactly right. At the end of the 3 years that the king had said he should bring them in, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. All right, now I learned, first of all, the ability that has been given to Daniel and his friends. Now then, they come in to display this God-given ability before the king. And the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king. In other words, these four were at the top of the class. The great triumph and great victory that God wrought. Now Nebuchadnezzar doesn't see this. All he sees is that which they are able to do. Now, later on we're going to see how someone endeavors to take credit for it. But it says God gave it. All right, now then, as he continued to investigate and to test them in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. I want to tell you, when God did a work as a result of a purpose of heart, he allowed them to go to the test, go through the test. But when they continued to purpose in their heart, here, the great result, as prisoners in a pagan country, they stood head and shoulders over all of those in that classification. And then I find how long Daniel continued. Daniel continued even to the first year. In fact, he went through that time of King Cyrus the Medes. He lived through the entire Babylonian captivity and lived to see the return, first return back to Palestine. Great honor. So here you have a shining light concerning the work of God in the hearts and lives of young people who find themselves in such adverse circumstances, yet they purposed in their heart not to defile themselves. Quite a standard for you kids. I commend it to you. Commend it to you to begin right now, making that vow. You keep yourself separated from kids who don't have those vows. And you endeavor to encourage those kids to make such vows, because it pays big dividends. If we were to draw an application it could be something like this. Here is payday for these young people. Now listen, you and I have payday someday. We're all going to stand before the judgment seat of Christ. And this kind of an issue is going to be brought up. For we must all stand before the judgment seat of Christ and give an answer to those things done in the body, whether they be good or not. A wonderful illustration of the greatness of the grace of God. All right, that's the first chapter. Now then, I want to give you an assignment for while I'm gone. I want you to take the next 3 chapters. Now, I want you to have for me, when I come back, Roman numeral number 2, get your outlines out, where it says Visions of the Pagan Dignitaries, chapter 2:1 through 6:28, capital A, Nebuchadnezzar's Vision and Reign, chapter 2:1 through 4:37. I want you to have that entire section outlined. Okay? And I want you to have the corresponding material read in the book, Daniel, the Key to Prophetic Revelation. Okay? I want you to have that read. Good enough? Got your assignment? Then when I come back, I want you to hand in for me that outline. Don't use any material other than your unmarked Bible, okay? You study it out. You study it out and you hand it in to me. Fair enough? Okay, kids.